Patrick, in trying to understand what we are as human beings, we can ask about our mind, we can ask about the nature of consciousness. Another way to look at it is to ask, what are we as selves? I imagine myself as a self, but that's very vague. How can we begin to understand some of the complexity and the richness of what it takes to make a self?
Yes. I think you got to start by admitting that the self is not an illusion. There's a argument out there that the self is just empty, it's just an illusion. Well, if it is an illusion, it's a very persistent one. And all of religions, much of psychology, certainly much of clinical neuroscience, is about alterations in the self and how to help people get to a kind of self that they can live with, so.
Well, there is an argument to say it's an illusion, and that is that we have these different components that we think are all unified, but you can separate them sometimes by trauma or by injury or disease, that you can see that these things that we think are unified are really not. And so what we imagine to be a unified self is an illusion of our cognitive capacity to integrate them.
Yes, the self and its components can break down. Absolutely. The self is a complex entity. Absolutely. And yes, and in that sense, you might say it's an illusion because it's built up of all kinds of components. On the other hand, it's the self that suffers. Is suffering an illusion? It's the self that feels joy. Is that an illusion? And we have all these disciplines that are centered around building up a self or transforming a self or helping a person get to a place where he can live with him or herself. So it's not. So I would begin by saying the self is not an illusion. It's a complex entity.
Okay. Let me give you that. Sure. It's not an illusion. Now where do we go?
If we want to understand the nature of the self, then we use the standard scientific method. We start investigating its phenomenology, its characteristics, what parts of the brain involved, and so on and so forth. And I think I'm a neuropsychologist, so that's what I'm interested in. And I think when you look at all the cases where the self is altered after brain damage, there are a set of reliable neuropsychological correlates involved. And that, in my opinion, is always the right frontal temporal region. That's most critical.
So frontal part of the brain here, cerebral cortex, temporal, and side. So these together are the biological center of the self.
I would say so. And I would think most neurologists and neuroscientists who investigate the self say, absolutely. The right frontal temporal area is critical. Now, everyone else would say, yes, there are all these other areas involved as well, depending on what the self is engaging in and so on. It's very complex, but on a pretty reliable basis, if you get a bump in the head there, you're going to have a dramatic alteration in the sense of self. Mm-hmm. So that area is critical. Now, what is it about that area? How come that area? That's the interesting question, and that's something that might tell us something about the nature of the self.
Okay.
And as far as I can see, and I think this won't be too controversial, that area of the brain is an inhibitory center. All of the structures, all of the nerve fibers, the connecting nerve bundles, leaving that area go to other critical areas in the brain and inhibit those areas. So it's a controlling center. It's an inhibitory. It's a supra inhibitory center.
So when we say lower centers of the brain make us hungry, make us sexually active, make us aggressive, all the things that would be very animalistic or in the evolutionary phylogeny of how this all occurred. But the frontal part that's developed so much in human beings enable us to inhibit these natural tendencies that would have to be really simple about it.
That's right. The frontal lobes do all that, but I'm talking about the right frontal temporal. So the right frontal temporal region regulates and inhibits all the higher cortical functions as well. Not just the lower appetitive drives.
Okay.
But I'm talking about memory, I'm talking about working memory, I'm talking about language functions.
So how does that work?
Fibers go from that center and turn on and turn off other centers. It's, simple as that.
And I mean, the way we know that a lot of times is because of when it goes wrong. When
you get a bump in the head there. all of those centers downstream from there either get disinhibited or get lost.
And so what happens in either case? Give me an example of when they're disinhibited. When you have a bump on the head, when you have an injury or trauma or some degeneration, and you have a disinhibition, meaning the inhibition no longer works.
Frontal temporal dementia.
Okay, so what happens?
There are beautiful case studies of as the dementia progresses.
Beautiful in the scientific sense.
Right.
Right.
Not beautiful for the poor patient and his family.
Right.
But as the center degenerates,
Yes.
functions become disinhibited. And among some of the functions are artistic ability. So the ability to visually capture a complex scene, almost in eidetic visual sense, manifests for a little while the dementia is progressing. And suddenly the paintings of this person become extraordinary.
So as you have a degeneration in the inhibition center, the artistic center where they're drawing these capabilities become enriched.
For a while.
For a while.
Yes. Yeah. And you see cases of people suddenly becoming intensely religious. Again, that's an element of disinhibition because they are reading voraciously, everything's significant to them, so everything's getting tagged as salient and significant. So
discrimination is less, so they're not able to differentiate between the levels of reality or importance.
A value hierarchy.
Yeah.
Becomes problematic. So that's another case of disinhibition. Now they're becoming hyper-religious. Again, only a certain period.
So what you're doing is you're having a change in the self.
Exactly.
Based upon a biological change. So we can infer immediately back to what the self is in its normal state by what's happening to the self in this degenerating state.
And I think one valid inference would be, okay, the center that's involved here is an inhibitory, a regulatory center. Therefore, the self is a regulatory device. At a minimum, I think it's more accurate to say the self is a perceptual device. But at a minimum, it's a regulatory device. It orchestrates all of the capacities of a human being, brings them to bear on a particular pressing issue so that the person functions effectively.
Yeah, I think it would be fair that when we say self, when we think of a self, a lot of the things we do is inhibiting our other things that we would have a tendency to do, and so you have this struggle. I mean, all religions talk about it. You have a struggle between different pulls and drives that one would have,
right? Particularly around big immediate rewards versus distant big rewards as well.
Such as?
Well, do I eat a piece of cake now, or do I look better?
Right.
5 years down the road.
I face that every day. Right.
So,
Yeah.
That's obviously an inhibitory capacity. That's a self-regulating capacity. Can I delay immediate gratification of desires in service to a future better goal?
And that only makes sense if I think of myself as a self.
Right. That's going to be there.
Yeah.
You're serving your future self there. That future self is real. It exerts an effect on your current behavior. It's a measure of your inhibitory power. The more you build up the future self, the self you want to become, and that's what religions do. They're always saying, become this bigger self. The more you're capable of doing that, the better.
I'm trying to become a thinner self.
Yeah, for example, or a more moral self, or a more compassionate self. But that's a future self. And the more you build it up, the better able you are to inhibit those immediate desires and appetites that get you in trouble.